today, but without further adu, let's get talking about some compost DIY. I wanted to get into the basics of composting today. Heck, Helen and I were joking about this earlier. There's not a lot bad you can say about compost. So the more of it we can make, the better off we're going to be. I want to thank one of my collaborators with the city of Plano. This is a presentation that I've been using for years now to teach folks how they can compost in their backyard if they wanted to. So along with that, we're going to talk about why you should compost, what it is, what you need to be successful, how you build a compost pile, and then really sort of explain what's going on into your compost pile and how to maintain it. If we have enough time, we can go into a little bit of troubleshooting, but if we run out of time, because I want to make sure that we have time for questions, I'll make sure that Helen has a PDF copy that can be sent out to anybody that would like it. So why should we compost? Probably the number one reason is to save landfill space. We're sending more than 5 million tons of yard trimmings to our landfills. And these are trimmings and other forms of organic matter that we could be turning into compost and using in our gardens and in our landscapes, which is, a wonderful thing for our soils, a wonderful thing for our plants, a wonderful things for our microbes that live in the soil. We'll talk about those in a bit. Additionally, the cost of transporting those materials to the landfill is very expensive, and these numbers probably need to be updated, but, as of 5-6 years ago, we were talking about $150 million annually spent sending those 5 tons of yard trimmings to the landfill. So they're taking up space and costing us money. And that space, about 15 million cubic yards. Anybody that's ever bought soil at a store, let that sink in for a minute. That's not cubic feet. That's cubic yards of material, 15 million cubic yards. So this is a big issue. Thinking about what we normally send in the trash, well, probably 40% roughly are paper goods of some kind. And these are recyclables. About 13% yard trimmings. We send 12% foods. Now we're getting into, plastics, metals, glass, and other. But we're still looking at we're still looking at over 50% of our trash going to the landfill when it could be recycled or composted in some way. And why should we compost? Well, I already touched on a few of these things. We're going to build soil health, build structure, help our plants. That compost can help reduce or eliminate the need for synthetic fertilizers, especially in ornamental landscapes, permanent landscapes. Less so if you're doing vegetable gardening or stuff like that, because I don't want you to think of compost as a fertilizer. Yes, it has nutrients in it, but it's sort of a different beast. So don't necessarily think of it as fertilizer, but it can be a long-term nutrient source for our microbe population and down the line for our plants. Compost is going to help us save water. Compost-rich soils retain water. Now, for every 1% increase in organic matter, and the amount of water per acre can swing quite dramatically because it depends on the soil type. I've seen it range anywhere from 8,000 gallons of water per acre to 27,000 gallons per acre. So depending on the texture of the soil and the water retention qualities of that soil, you can hold on to a different amount of water. The neat thing about the water that we save using compost in the soil, that is plant available water. So our clays, while our clay soils can hold a tremendous amount of moisture, not all of that water is accessible by plants. When we start working in organic matter and building that structure, we are making more of that water available to our plants. And that's really the goal there. And this is before we even start talking about mulching our plants to save water as well. You're going to improve your soil structure. So if we had sandy soils, and if anybody logged in today has a sandier soil, think of adding compost to a soil as like adding lots of bits of sponge. It's going to help retain that moisture instead of it running right through the soil. In a clay, it helps loosen up our soils. Rather than our clays forming sheets, which is what they really like to do, think of a stack of paper plates. Adding compost actually causes our soils to clump up and form clods, which are beds or aggregates. And that is the actual soil building process. This builds the spaces in between those soil particles, and that's where plant roots live, microbes live. That's where water and air likes to live. That's called pore space. And adding compost, it builds that pore space, and that's the name of the game. With that, when you build in more pore space, this leads to your plants being healthier, more disease resistant, and in trickle-down effect, they might even look better than your neighbors. And there's a lot of reasons why your plants are going to be healthier and more disease resistant. It comes down, you are feeding your soil. So think of this. Feed your soil and it will feed your plants. We've got a lot of microbes and other critters that live in the soil that are very beneficial. Many of them actually help combat diseases that take down our plants. So by adding that organic matter, adding the compost, you're adding a food source for that population. And then they're down there working, building a better soil for our plants and helping fight some of those diseases. So compost is really our magic potion here in North Texas. You really can't get enough of it. Whenever you get the opportunity to work organic matter into our soils, I tell you, do it, because your plants will love you for it. So what exactly is composting? I always call it just decomposition with class. It's rotting. We're duplicating nature's recycling, which is the rotting process. We're just doing it in a controlled manner that's focused and accelerated. Can you just throw a bunch of stuff in a pile and compost? Yes, you can. Newsflash, that's known as a type B pile. It is my preferred pile because I'm not an active composter. But we are just harnessing the critters and the natural processes to break these materials down into something that we can use. So we are recycling selected waste. We're talking DIY, at home, in your backyard, composting, okay? Not large commercial scales like we have here in Collin County with Texas Pure Products and the large composting facility in Melissa. We're talking about what you're capable of doing in your backyard. So for that, you're really using yard trimmings, fallen leaves, and selected kitchen wastes. Selected kitchen waste, not all of it. I have a slide that talks about that in a little bit. We're creating that natural slow release nutrient source, right? Think of organic matter, you're building soil health. That's the goal. You are building soil health, healthy soil, healthy plants. So what do you need to be successful? Well, you need a spot. You need a bin, or you need a place of some kind. You've got all different types. There's standalones. You've got some that'll tumble themselves. You've got singles, doubles, triple bin systems. I'm not picky, but the minimum, what I am picky about is that minimum size, 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. So that minimum of a cubic yard is the minimum. Bigger is better, but it comes down to temperature retention, because you're going to be getting some temperatures. You need that pile to heat up in order for it to start breaking down. If you're smaller than that cubic yard, that becomes more difficult. And there's some ways around that, but try to have at least a cubic yard of materials. These plastic bins work fine. Typically, they're more expensive, but they're contained. So some folks prefer this because if they have pets, that's pretty handy. If you have varmint populations, it's nice to keep them contained. These are just a couple of examples that you see here. If you search the internet, you will find umpteen different kinds of composting bins. If you go to your home and garden store, you're going to find a few more. You'll find some that people have built themselves. There's an example of a tumbling one on the right-hand side. The one on the left, it could be closed, but it folds up and you can put it away. I don't know when you'd really do that, but you can. This is the sort of bin that I grew up with. I'll tell you, it did turn into a giant ant pile at some point, and really just became the spot where my dad threw his yard trimmings, but whatever. And it's just metal fencing material that's used into a square called a shepherd's bin. I love the Carpenter Special. It's basically the shepherd's bin with a little bit of wood framing. So if you've got a family member or a friend that likes to think of themselves as a craftsman, you could have them build you a compost pile if you'd like. I've seen the right-hand side, which is very much like the shepherd's bin. This is just welded wire fencing that's wrapped in a circle. And if you go to the urban farm over in Dallas County off Rowlett Road, where my Dallas County colleague works, they've got about 7 or 8 of these at different stages of breakdown, sort of scattered around their urban farm, which is really, it's sort of a triple or multi-bin system, just separated. So this is out at Myers Park. And the whole idea here is pick one end, and that's where you start. And then as you move, as that compost, those materials start to break down, you would turn it over to the next, and so on and so on and so on. And the ideal is you would wind up having finished compost on one end and sort of halfway in the middle and fresh stuff on the end. These can be successful. I tend to find most folks are more successful if they just have a single pile at home that everything goes to. Because if you think of this, that's now 3 cubic yards of material that you need to have in order to compost effectively. All right. So, but it's certainly an option for you. As I said, you'd start on one end and gradually move those materials down the line. Top left corner, my preferred pile. That is a cold pile, a type B pile. It is simply a pile, and you just keep adding stuff to it. But you can get as artisan if you'd like. Now, the one with the dude, our shadowy friend standing there with a shovel, I haven't the foggiest idea if that thing would work. I don't think it would, but it's on the internet and you can find it. So the overarching theme here, folks, is you've got to have a spot that's at least big enough to hold a cubic yard of material in order to compost effectively. Need a handful of tools, not a lot. Most of us gardeners already have them. A wheelbarrow makes things really handy. It's a lot easier than just running around with a shovel. But you also need a garden fork, you need a shovel, a water hose, thermometer, gloves, and then your nose and your hands. I will always tell people when we're talking about composting, your schnoz is a wonderful tool. Because if things start to smell bad or not smell right, that's a really good indicator that something is not quite right with your compost pile. The same for if you are buying compost at the store. If you get a bag of compost and you open it up or you smell it and you're, oh, don't use it. There's something wrong with it. It's either not fully finished composting or it's rotted. I mean, yes, we're doing, classy rotting here, but your compost shouldn't smell bad, whether it's coming out of a bag from the store or it's in your backyard. There shouldn't be a ton of smell. Now, what ingredients do you need? Well, and I love this. People say, well, we have this easy to remember saying here, and it's CAT3M or ATM3. And that's just air, time, and the 3 M's: materials, mass, and moisture. So greens and browns, greens and browns are your materials. And think of brown as carbon and green is nitrogen, right? And we'll get into that in more detail here in a minute. Mass, that cubic yard minimum. Moisture, about 50%. Think of a damp sponge. If you have a soaking sponge and you wring it out as much as you can, that is what it should feel like, that texture and that feel of that sponge. That's about 50% moisture. Air, the microbes that we want to cultivate that do the breakdown for us, those require air. They are aerobic, not anaerobic. If you think anaerobic, and this is where grass clippings become problematic, that's smelly and it's very inefficient. So you don't get a lot of compost and you get a lot of smell. And that's the opposite math from what we really want. And then time. Now, remember, we are focusing and hopefully accelerating the normal natural process of decomposition. Depending on how you manage your pile, you can speed that process up. That being said, you're probably going to need at least 6 months, probably more like a year before you have any compost that's fully finished and ready to be used. Okay. So let's talk about our browns. These are our carbon sources. Now, all of our materials are going to contain carbon or nitrogen, but think of your browns as having a higher ratio of carbon to nitrogen. And your greens have more nitrogen than carbon, okay? And your browns are providing energy for microbes. This is your fuel source. So dried leaves, paper and cardboard that is unlined. You don't want shiny paper. You don't want shiny cardboard. You don't want the packing tape that was on the box. You don't want the shipping labels. You just want plain, unlined cardboard, okay? Sawdust. Very, very small amounts of sawdust, but you can use some. Hay is a source. This day and age, I tell you, go sell hay because they've got a lot of hungry cows probably right now, but you can use hay in your compost pile. And then other dried yard and garden waste. Your greens are nitrogens. These are promoting growth. So nitrogen is sort of our enzymatic fuel, which is what's fueling the decay process. You can get this from manures, even though I would encourage you not to use manure in your home compost pile. Fresh cut grass clippings, green leaves, coffee grounds, other vegetable scraps, and then other green garden trimmings. So this is sort of your springtime and summer stuff. Your browns are a lot of our fall and winter type materials, okay? Ideally, and this is, I'm going to explain it, but it's sort of difficult to see until we start talking about building a pile. You want about 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. This is why when folks just use, say, grass clippings and green materials, it's not a very good compost pile, and it tends to start to smell really bad after a while because there's so much nitrogen and there's not enough carbon. So you want about 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And this is based on, that's the optimum diet for our microbes, right? So let's talk about that more on this next slide here. Our browns, so dried leaves, corn stalks, straw, sawdust, newspaper. Look at those ratios. This is carbon to nitrogen. So you have high carbon to low nitrogen. And then when you get over into our greens, so our veggie waste, I don't know why alfalfa hay's in here, but it's a good example. It's very, very tender, has a much higher nitrogen source than a traditional hay would have. Grass clippings, rotted manures. Yes, you still have higher carbon to nitrogen, but it's below that 30 to 1. And you can never get to that ideal ratio if you're only using those greens. So you'll wind up with a pile that smells to high heaven. It'll almost smell like ammonia because those grass clippings will pack so tightly that suddenly you don't have oxygen. That's anaerobic. So we don't have the microbes we need, we've got a stinky, smelly mess. So you need to use a mixture of these carbons and nitrogens, these browns and greens. I'm going to say it. I'm going to keep saying it. It's a cubic yard, 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. So if you're starting a compost pile, try to accrue some materials first before you start building, right? And understand that these materials are going to shrink down over time. So that 3 foot by 3 foot, you're going to need to continue to add to it to maintain that. It's all about insulation. Yes, you can legitimately put a blanket on your compost pile if you want to. I've seen people do it with a tarp. In the wintertime, I've seen people do it with a big blanket of dried leaves to help insulate as well. That's what this capping is called. Capping and putting a blanket on it are basically the same thing. And it is an effective measure for keeping those temperatures where you want them. And to a certain degree, can help you maintain moisture levels. When you're figuring out where you want to put your compost pile, here in the great state of Texas, you really don't want to put your compost pile in full sun because one, yes, it's great for heat retention, not good for moisture retention. And you want 50 to 60% moisture for that ideal. If you're in full sun, that could be pretty difficult. Any of you guys that know me know that I really don't like watering landscapes anyways. Well, I really don't like having to water my compost pile any more than I have to. So think about that when you're trying to locate your pile. Part shade is probably the best spot for it somewhere. If that's possible, cool. If it's not, it is what it is. You just do the best that you can. Understand that you may wind up adding some moisture at some point. A couple ways to measure moisture. You could use a moisture meter, and will tell you whether it's dry, moist, or wet. It's just The one I use is something like 13 or 14 bucks off the internet right now. Very simple to use. They do work. Or you could use that squeeze test. So thinking back to the damp sponge, it's the same idea. You reach in, get you a handful of material and squeeze it and feel it. And if you squeeze it and water is pouring out of it, it's way too wet. You need to open that pile up and dry some of that moisture out. Again, if it's that full of moisture, there's not much oxygen and you could have anaerobic conditions. Another reason why our greens, which tend to have higher moisture content, if you have too much of them, can cause other issues, should feel like a damp sponge. That's what that material should feel like, just damp. That's all that you need. And if you dig into your pile and it's dusty and blowing everywhere, then you need to add some water as well. Please remember that your microbes need that oxygen. They need moisture, but they also need oxygen. We want these aerobic conditions. That's what's going to keep those microbes running as most efficiently as possible and keeps those odors low. When you get to anaerobic conditions, your nose will tell you all about it because it will stink. It'll smell like ammonia or sulfur. Some people, they'll think the cat's been TTing around the house or something like that. No, it could be the compost pile. When your compost starts to smell, it's also slowing down because it's not running as efficiently as it could. And this is already a fairly lengthy process. So we want to keep it as speedy as we can possibly get to. If you want a shorter time, we've hit all those highlights. 50% moisture, good balance of materials, plenty of oxygen. If you want to just let it go and leave it running, that's fine too. That's called letting nature take its course. And all you can do is just keep adding materials to it. It's totally up to you when you decide to use those materials, right? Now, I told you there were some things that we don't want to do in our backyards. Number one is pet waste. And I'll include your own waste as well. Don't use your own feces. Don't use your pet feces. Generally speaking, if you're going to use any sort of waste, you would use manure. And I would already tell you, I encourage you not to do that. Leave manures out. Let your manure compost on its own. It's a different animal. And there's other issues with manures as well that you can run into. Stick with other yard trimmings and other organic materials. I would leave manures out, but please do not use pet waste. Don't use your own waste. That's a good way to bring in pathogens that you don't want to bring into your garden. Also, leave out meats and dairy. These materials take a very, very, very long time to break down. And they also do a tremendous job of bringing critters into your compost pile, which will do a tremendous job of scattering all around the yard. Which is also not good. The same goes for bones. They're also an attractant, but they also take ages to break down. And we don't want that. Now, there are larger composting, commercial size composters, sometimes those materials will be taken because they have the capacity to do that. They can reach temperatures and they have time to work those materials. Don't do it at home. Don't do it at home. The same with fats and oils. These materials really don't break down very well, and they're not good for your compost pile. I have waxed cardboard here. Really, if your cardboard or papers are shiny, then you don't want to use them. And the same, compostables are an interesting one. And I'm going to get back to weed seed. I haven't skipped it yet. If you see something branded as compostable, so think about the plant pots that you get that are made of compostable materials. Yes, those materials will break down. And I'm a proponent for them. I do like them. They don't necessarily break down in the time frame that we're looking for in a home compost pile. Remember, those pots have to survive being watered every day or every other day for how long before they make it to your house and that plant goes into the ground. So these materials, while they're biodegradable, they're very resilient and they resist that breakdown. So if you can buy plants in those pots, cool. Please do it. They're good. Just understand, I wouldn't tell you to put those compostable things in your compost pile because they take forever to break down. So let's go back to talk about weed seed, because when you're using garden trimmings and yard trimmings, you need to be aware of the weeds that are in your yard. Because if you're putting weed seed into that compost pile, and let's say you're not reaching some of those elevated temperatures in the 140s, 150, you're probably not going to kill that weed seed. So then when you go to use that compost in a garden, well, you've just now placed that weed seed into your garden with a lovely nutrient-rich material. So you can spread problematic weeds, and I'm talking things like Dallas grass, King Ranch blue stem, some of our very, very problematic weed species that are difficult to control and very easy to get out of hand. So just be aware of the materials you're using. Try not to put weed seed into there. If you've got a lot of weeds in your yard, then maybe you shouldn't use those grass clippings for that matter. Okay, so there you go. All right, now who's on our team? I've talked a lot about microorganisms, and these little dudes do fantastic work for us. And there's three main groups that I intend to talk about. So you have psychrophilic, mesophilic, and thermophilic. And they're classified based on the temperatures that they prefer. So your psychrophilics are less than 50 degrees. They like it when it's cool. So these are the ones that will work pretty much all winter long. These are the guys that are down in our soils that are breaking compost and other materials down during the cool seasons over the winter. Then our mesophilics are our sort of year-round folks. So anywhere from 50 degrees up to 113 degrees. I'd hate to be the grad student that had to find that temperature, but these ones are the ones that break down cellulose. Cellulose, things in cell walls. These are very, very, very tough materials in plants. Then your thermophilics. These guys like it hot, 113 to 158 degrees. Don't get above 160 degrees. When you get above 160, you're actually going to start killing off your thermophilics. All right. And that's why I mentioned early on, a thermometer is a key weapon when you're composting, because you really want to keep it between that 113, 158 to get really good breakdown. And that's in the center. Okay. Now we have bacteria that do a lot of good work for us. These are single-celled organisms. They come in three basic shapes: rods, spheres, and spirals. They are our primary decomposers. So they're sort of the first ones that get to work on our compost, breaking things down at the microbial level. I love this fact. 250,000 to 500,000 can fit on the period at the end of the sentence. Now, depends on what font you're at, I get you, but that's a lot. And they do tremendous work for us. Now, Actinomyces is one of my personal favorites. I didn't know that I had a favorite composting organism, but apparently I do. If you've ever dug into the soil and you get that rich, earthy smell, that's caused by Actinomyces. That is the organism that actually releases that odor. It's a higher form of bacteria. It's more similar to a fungi or a mold. And it's really responsible for releasing carbon, nitrogen, and then ammonia, which is really another nitrogen source. Now we get into our fungi. These are primitive plants, but they lack chlorophyll. So they get their energy by breaking down organic matters, right? When you see mold or that white material on your mulch in your gardens, don't be alarmed. That's a good thing. That is showing you that you have organisms that are breaking those materials down, which is feeding your soil, right? When you see mushrooms, that's the fruiting body of a fungi. That's another indicator that you have an active soil. You have organic matter down there that's being broken down and released to the environment. That's a good thing. Now we get into our soil invertebrates. We are talking about everybody's, the humble garden, the earthworm, the humble earthworm. And these are physical decomposers. They are chewing and grinding up materials into smaller materials that then are fungi and molds and bacteria and other organisms then break down further and further and further. So these are first, second, and third level consumers. We're now getting back into biology, back in high school, where we talked about the different levels in a food web, you know, who eats who and at what level, right? So we're talking all sorts of different creepy crawlies, earthworms, wolf spiders, beetles, different mites and centipedes. We could even talk to a certain degree about certain mammals that grind materials into smaller ones. So if you ever think of something like a beaver that chews and knocks a tree down, and then they cut it up into smaller pieces, well, when that passes through the beaver, that's now smaller organic materials that can be broken down by these other composting organisms. So that's the team that's working for us. And we're essentially just building a home for them and providing them with something to eat. That is the goal of composting, is to do that. If you build it, they will come and they will do the work for you. So how do we do that? Let's build this here compost pile. Well, I already said it. If you build it, they will come. And that is true. You don't need to worry about adding earthworms. You don't need to worry about adding organisms. They are already there. You just need to build them the house and they will come live in it. Believe me. Now, number one thing, if you have large materials, you need to reduce that particle size down. The bigger the object, the longer it takes to break down. So you could do that chopping it up, grinding it up, shredding. Some people like to use leaf mulchers, what's it called? A wood grinder, things like that. You need to break those materials down into as small of particles as you can get if you want your compost pile to work as quickly and efficiently as possible. Then we got to start talking about how to add moisture. The most effective way, and this is Mr. Brian Moore, he helped build this presentation. His and my recommended method for adding moisture is to fill your wheelbarrow with water. And then you dump your materials, which is our feedstock. We're feeding our compost pile. So you would dunk that feedstock into the water and just sort of let it sit there for a minute. And when you fork it out and add it to the pile, it's pretty much picked up as much water as it wants to retain, right? That's the most way. It's more accurate than building a pile and then trying to water it as you build. I've found that when you try to do it that way, you wind up adding too much. If you do it this way, the feedstock itself sort of self-limits how much water it's going to add to the pile. Another way to do it is you fill your wheelbarrow with materials and then you put your garden hose into it. I like the first way better, but it's up to you guys. So let's talk about the lasagna method. And it's just like building a lasagna. And if you haven't built a lasagna, you can do it this way. Just substitute your materials for cheese and noodles and sauce. But you're going to alternate between browns and greens. Start with a 4 to 6 inch layer of brown. So that's our high carbon to nitrogen. Then come back with a thinner layer, 3 to 4 inches of your green, that low carbon to nitrogen. And you keep doing this, alternating brown, green, brown, green, brown, green, until your bin is full or until you run out of materials. Continue to do this when you add materials as well as you can, because you want to maintain that 25 to 30 brown to 1 green, that 25 to 30 carbon to 1 part nitrogen. When you're continuing to add materials, you need to try to add them in that ratio. So when you add materials while you're maintaining your compost pile, you want to try to add them in that same ratio so that you don't get any problems. Do the best that you can, and then keep an eye on it with your nose and your moisture meter. Now we're getting into sort of, what do you want to do? How involved do you want to be in your compost pile? The sort of bare minimum that you need to do is monitoring that moisture and heat. If your compost pile is really dry or really cold or a combination, well, you're probably not getting a good active pile. There might be a problem. Your nose, I call this passive monitoring because it will tell you if it stinks. There's probably a problem and you need to check it out. But do you want to turn your pile to aerate? Do you care? Do you want to? Do you have a means of doing it? If you want your pile to be more active and compost a little quicker, turning is generally a way to do that, but you don't have to do it that way if you want to. So think of a compost pile as either active or passive. A type A would be a hot pile. This is one where you are turning that pile frequently. Cold pile, not so much. Cold pile is much more like that. Pile it somewhere and forget about it. Understand there's many different methods and many different containers. They're both built the same way. Brown to green, brown, green, brown, green. Watering those materials, whether you're going to do it with the garden hose or you'll do it in your wheelbarrow, you'll turn this pile. You are actively engaged with this pile. You are checking its temperature. You might see a temperature north of 160. You might have to get in here and open that pile up to release a little bit of that heat, right? And then that would tell you that you need to maybe slow it down a little bit so you're not turning it as frequently. Okay, that's a type A hot pile. A cold pile is built the same way, but then you pretty much leave it alone. You just let it do its thing and you continue to add materials to the top. You'll notice with a type B pile, you'll see it both with a type A and a type B. You'll have more distinctive layers in the type B to where you'll have that dark material down at the bottom and less broken down, less composted materials as you work your way up through the pile because you're not turning it. But you'll see that. It's up to you. It's personal preference on how you want to manage your pile. Type A, you're going to be turning it regularly. Type B, you're not doing anything. You just build it, forget about it, come back a year or two later. Okay, or more. It depends. So I've got just a couple more minutes real quick, and then I'll start taking questions, but I will touch on troubleshooting. Okay, because troubleshooting is a pretty large field, but number one, you check your compost pile and it's cold. And by cold, I mean it's, maybe it's 70 something degrees in there. It's certainly not triple digits, right? It's not churning and burning. Well, this could be caused by a handful of reasons. Maybe there's not enough nitrogen. Remember, nitrogens fuel that enzymatic process, those enzymes that are actively breaking those materials down. That process generates heat. So it could be that you don't have enough nitrogen. Maybe you don't have enough moisture, so your microbes are not surviving very well. Here's the fun part. You might have too much moisture. It might be too wet. So again, your microbes are struggling so that you're not breaking those materials down efficiently and you're not generating that heat. The pile might be too small, so it's not insulated enough. Or you might just have an imbalance of materials. This is where if you have materials that are too big, they're taking too long to break down. So you're not generating as much heat. The other thing that it might be, and your nose and the color of the material will tell you, your pile might be finished. It might be done composting, in which case it's supposed to cool off because it's done its thing. The solutions are on the right-hand side. Let's touch on a few others. If any of you guys would like these, I can provide them to you. It's no trouble because I know I'm going through these really quickly. If nothing is breaking down, it is the wrong balance of materials or the wrong types of materials or the wrong size of materials. You see this an awful lot when people are throwing large pieces of woody materials into a pile. That stuff takes donkey's years to break down. You can speed it up by grinding it up, but even then, those materials still take a long time to break down. Flies, well, usually that's food waste. And it's exposed. If you're putting foods, kitchen scraps into a compost pile, you need to burrow into the middle of it and stick it down in the middle. If you don't, you're going to welcome insects, mainly flying insects. So our buddy, the fly, and even rats and other rodents and other critters and varmints that we really don't want to encourage any more than we have to around our homes. Another reason to be very selective about what kitchen scraps go into your compost pile. If your pile's too hot, generally speaking, that is too much nitrogen. And this one is rather difficult to get to because generally if you have too much nitrogen, you wind up anaerobic anyways, and the pile will start to smell. So it'll be hot and stinky. Okay. And you can fix that by just adding in more brown stuff, cardboard, papers, leaves, dried leaves, things like that. Let's talk about ammonia. So this is the one where I've mentioned people think cats are out in the backyard TTing on the house and stuff. Again, too much nitrogen, normally in the form of grass clippings. This is very, very, very common. You get in the summertime and you might be cutting a couple times a week. That's a lot of grass clippings. It gets out of hand in a hurry. It's not just grass clippings, it's other greens, so manures, food wastes, but the most common culprit is grass clippings. You just need to remember the ratios when you are building that pile. Think of it in terms of inches. If I add an inch of grass clippings, I need to add 2 inches of browns. If I add 2 inches of grass clippings, I need to add 4 inches of browns. That's a generally pretty good way of keeping that ratio in sync. And then if your pile smells like it's rotten eggs, it's usually too much food scraps. It can be grass. But it's again, you're out of balance, too much green stuff, and you're just getting those anaerobic conditions that are leading to those foul smells. But if you can get a pile that's working for you and you use that compost, you can do amazing things with it. Your plants will love you. Your soils will love you. This is the most common thing with it. I can't make enough. You can't. You're going to make compost in your backyard and you're still going to wind up going to the store to buy more. But remember, the more stuff that we can compost in our backyard, the more space that we can save going to our landfills, the more money we can save transporting those materials. We can get better efficiency with the water that we're using, and your plants are going to love you for it. So just try to compost it. It's not too hard. There are master composting classes that are sort of scattered around. If you Google search Master Composter Texas, you'll find some of those. Here's some of the different groups that were involved with the information you received today. With that, I'll take your questions. Thank you guys for listening.
Brad, thank you so much. That was a great that was a great presentation over everything. You're even getting applause from people. Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes to add any extra questions into the chat for Brad. And so I just want to remind everybody of a couple of things. If you are on the live Zoom, you can send your name and email address directly to me through the chat feature, and you can be entered into a drawing for a garden toolkit. The garden toolkit has things in there like a rain gauge, a moisture meter, some gloves, and a trowel, and some printed materials that can help you with your gardening here in North Texas. Also, I want to let everyone know that the session is being recorded and it will be posted on the NTMWD YouTube page in a few days. So it'll be available for replay and for sharing. And just to let you guys know about Brad, in case you don't know him, he's been a regular speaker on our series. He is the County Extension Agent for Horticulture with Texas A&M AgriLife in Collin County. And so he does know what he's talking about, and I bet he's built a compost pile or two in his day. All right. Okay. Brad has generously agreed to send me his slides. And so I will send out an email after a couple days after this presentation with a link to the presentation on YouTube, plus with a copy of his slides. So be on the lookout for that email. Okay. All right. So let's start our questions. So Sarah has 2 questions. And this one you kind of covered a little bit. Should the compost be damp like a sponge when you toss it into the bin? So like when you're adding your extra layers?
It'll probably be a little more moist than that whenever you're building the pile. You're going to, like, if you were to, let's say you were doing the wheelbarrow approach, which is what I recommend, when you pull that feedstock out, it's going to be dripping with some water. I'm okay with that when you're building, because when you first build that pile, it's going to do a lot of drying out while it's sort of getting settled in. So it's going to be a little bit more moist than that. But as it gets going and when you're checking on it is when you want it to have that damp sponge feel.
Okay, so if I am doing like cold composting and I'm just, I gathered a whole bunch of stuff and I'm going to toss it in there on top of my pile, do I need to wet it down or do I just toss it on there?
It's up to you. If you're doing like the true, honest to goodness cold pile where you don't care and you're just adding it to the pile, then no. But if the pile looks kind of dry and dusty, go for it. You could moisten it when you throw it on there, that'd be fine. But the whole thing with a cold pile is you're really just adding to it and you're not worrying about the rest of that stuff. So my true answer would be to check it before, and if it's soaking wet or really moist inside, then I'd tell you not to. So that's it's a wishy-washy answer, pardon the pun. But it's really up to you. If you just want to fling it on the cold pile, cool. But if you want to moisten it a little bit before you do, I'm cool with that too.
Okay, so it sounds like I'm not going to hurt anything either way.
Nope.
Okay. All right. So thumbs up, thumbs down, eggshells in the compost pile.
Depends on its usage. I guess I'll give a general thumbs up, followed by a good old AgriLife extension. It depends. So if you're using your compost in our native clay soils, you don't really need the calcium that eggshells provide. We've got calcium in spades. But they don't really bother me. If you do use eggshells, you need to grind them up as finely as you can, like let them dry out, and then grind them up. I'll bet you several nickels that whenever you get done with that compost, you're still going to see bits of eggshell in there. You can see that it really hasn't broken down that much. So I'm not opposed to it. I don't really think you need it in a compost. Our native soils certainly don't need any additional compost in them. So if you want to, cool. It's one less thing going to a landfill. But you don't necessarily need them in there at all.
Okay.
Which something I forgot to tell you guys about. Our soil testing lab down in College Station will do nutrient analysis on composts, just like you would with a soil sample. So if you were curious what the nutrient content of a compost is, you can have that checked out. You just send a sample down to the lab in College Station, just like you would a normal soil sample, and you'll get a report back on it.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So you don't have to indicate that it's compost. It's just a surprise when they get it. Right?
I don't think you have to indicate it, but it's pretty obvious when it gets down there. That's what it is.
That's true, especially if there's bits of eggshell in it.
There you go, exactly.
Okay. All right. So another thumbs up, thumbs down. Coffee grounds.
In moderation. So coffee grounds are a green in the brown and green chart, right? You can use them just in moderation. They're very acidic. Not necessarily acidic enough to cause huge troubles, but they're easy to get out of balance with. You'd honestly probably have better usage for coffee grounds if you just flung them out in your yard and did it that way. Mainly because you're going to have probably what I would call better green sources available throughout the year, but you can use them. You can certainly use them in a compost pile. That's fine. I prefer not to, but you can.
Okay, so I actually do that. I take my coffee grounds and I dump them like base of a tree or in my bed, flower beds or wherever. So okay, so I'm glad I'm not, doing anything terrible. Okay, so this is a really good question talking about flinging. Scott is asking, what's the best way to spread compost into your yard?
When you're doing that, we would call that top dressing, and it can be interesting. If you've never top dressed a yard before with compost, it's a lesson in technique. The number one thing you're probably going to run into with compost is you need to run it through a sieve of some kind. So using like some hardware cloth, which is just basically metal mesh for those of you that don't know, with like a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch screen. That makes the particles that are coming through small enough that once you just scatter them on your yard, you could do it with a shovel. You could do it by hand. However you want to get it spread across the yard is fine, as evenly as you can. And then you want to actually work it down into the soil. You want to work it down so that it makes its way down to the soil surface. And that's the hardest part, especially if the pieces are quite large, because it gets caught in the canopy and the thatch of the yard. So however you want to get it scattered, there are compost scattering machines. I don't know where you could rent one or if you even could, I know when I top dress mine, I use I go around the yard with my wheelbarrow and I just sort of make piles, and then I scatter it with either a garden rake or a leaf rake. And then the bulk of the work is actually when you're sitting there kind of trying to work it down to the soil. If you sieve it first to make sure the pieces aren't really big, that helps an awful lot.
Interesting. All right. So can you use one of those like green spreaders to spread your compost?
Like a fertilizer spreader, it'd be probably pretty difficult. One, the particle size is going to be tough because that opening is not very big on one of those. And I think you'd wind up, I don't think you'd have much success because most of your compost, when you are using it, is probably going to be that 50%-ish moisture, 40 to 50% moisture. So it's going to want to stick together. So I just think you'd have a devil of a time getting it out of the spreader, getting it to drop and spread. So somebody in this group needs to try it and then let the rest of us know. We call that citizen science.
Yes, it is. Okay, so on this topic, Scott asked, or he's thinking about using a peat moss spreader that you can rent from Home Depot. Do you think that would work?
While I ponder on that one,
which means you're going to look it up on the internet.
Exactly what I'm doing. I had a professor in college used to call this Professor Google. So that was a peat moss spreader.
Yes.
Cool.
Available for rent from Home Depot.
Yeah. I mean, in theory, oh, I'd never heard it called that before. I don't know why, but yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about now. That should work. The same thing you're going to run into, it's the particle size, which really, if you're using one of these, you could just shovel it in there, because it will sieve out whatever's small enough to fall through the grate will fall through, and the stuff that's too big won't. And then you just periodically dump the thing out, dump all the large materials back out. Same issue you're going to run into, I think, with the other spreader. The stuff's going to be pretty moist. And I mean, peat moss can be somewhat moist whenever you buy it, but it dries out a little faster than compost does. So you may not have as good, you might not have as good results doing it this way. This would be another fun one for somebody. Try this and let us know how it worked and what your experience was. In theory, it should work just fine, as long as the stuff's not too wet. Okay, well, so Scott, yeah, it is. And Scott gave us a big will do, though. So he's going to tackle some citizen science and let us know how a peat moss spreader goes. All right, so we've had a couple of questions from Neil and from Gail wanting to know about cockroaches in the compost. Should they be there? Are they doing something wrong, or are they okay? So, and this is the cool thing, and this is talking to the guy. I don't like cockroaches. They're creepy. I don't like them. But when they're outside, especially our native cockroaches, so the large ones, the big, angry, scary ones that are like the size of a cat, those ones in a compost pile, they're great because they are chewing up leaf litter and those brown materials. They're one of our primary decomposers that actually break that and chew that stuff up. When I first got out of the Army, here's a little background on me. I did commercial pest control and residential pest control. One of the number one reasons that people had roaches in their garages was cardboard, old newspapers, and old packing materials, and it was providing a food source to those roaches. They'd come in because they wanted to eat up those carbon sources. If you're seeing them in a compost pile, that's good because they're working, they're doing their thing. And that's sort of the way I view many of our creepy crawlies. As long as they creep and crawl outside, cool. You creep and crawl into my wife's house, and suddenly they have become target number one because she has me attack them with vengeance. But no, in a compost pile, they are good to go. The one exception to that is, and I'm going to pull the link up, German cockroaches, which are the little bitty orange ones. Those are not good. Those are an imported cockroach, and they only follow humans around. And they're a very different animal. They don't live outside. They live in the presence of humans. So if you happen to see those, that's an indicator you might want to start scouting around your house and see if you have them other places, because they can be a bit of a booger to deal with. And I'll drop a link to those so that folks can see them if they want to see the yicky cockroach. But no, that's a good question.
Yeah, it was. Okay, and so earlier you had mentioned that before in the past you used a shepherd's bin to build a compost pile, but you ended up with ants or fire ants in there. How is the best way to deal with fire ants in your compost pile?
My recommendation would be to use fire ant granules of some kind. Sadly, this is honestly, so I have two small children. My eldest is 2.5. My youngest is a year. One of the main reasons that Audrey and I haven't built a compost pile at our house is because we live in Texas and fire ants are now a way of life. That is a risk that you run having a compost pile that's open to the elements, like a shepherd's bin, like a cold pile. You run the risk of it turning into an ant pile. I mean, it's got good structure. There's creepy crawlies living in it that can provide a food source. You can, if you have a pile like that and you have ants, you can treat it with an insecticide. I mean, that's perfectly fine. Anything that's labeled for usage for fire ants would be just fine, or any, species of ants, because the labels are all a little bit different. But I'd recommend probably using something like a granular, a bait, preferably. Baits are generally the best. You just need to identify the ant correctly, which is not too terribly difficult. And control them that way. Another reason, I just sort of nonchalantly said, dive into your compost pile and feel it. Poke it with a stick first. That's also, that's a pro tip from colleague, my buddy Chase, the ag agent. Pro tip, poke it with a stick. Before you start fishing around in your compost pile, give it a stir to make sure nothing is living in it that we don't want, like ants, like a snake. Let's say if my dad pulls a snake out of a compost pile, he's just going to keel over dead. But anyways, yeah. So for ants, just treat it with an insecticide and control them that way. I prefer a bait, but there are sprays, other granules. There's lots of different controls out there.
All right, fantastic. So it looks like we are actually going to end on time. I just want to remind everybody that all of our past virtual lunch and learns are on the NTMWD website at ntmwd.com/classes, and also they are on our YouTube page. So you can go to YouTube, search for NTMWD, and you can find links to all of our past sessions about a multitude of different types of topics. So I want to thank everybody so much for being here. It's your last chance to get entered into our toolkit drawing. If you want to send me your information. And with that, Brad and I thank you for being here, and happy composting.
Happy composting, everybody. Thank you, guys.